Royal families, from medieval Europe to the courts of Asia and the Pacific, shared one obsession above all else: blood. Not just the red substance flowing through veins, but the mystical, political idea of royal blood. For centuries, kings and queens believed their power came from divine will, and their offspring were seen as chosen by heaven itself. If that bloodline was diluted, if a prince or princess married beneath their rank, it was feared the sacred thread of legitimacy would unravel. This is why, time and again, dynasties turned inward, arranging marriages between cousins, uncles and nieces, and even siblings. To outsiders, this might appear grotesque or unnatural, but inside the gilded walls of palaces, it was considered a necessity for survival. In the medieval imagination, marriage was rarely about love. It was a matter of strategy. Every union was a chess move on the vast board of Europe, where kingdoms and empires rose or fell based on alliances sealed in matrimony. A young princess might be promised to her cousin across the border not because they loved each other, but because their shared ancestry guaranteed that their heirs would carry on the same bloodline, uniting two crowns under a single, unbroken chain. These were contracts of power, dressed up as holy unions. The irony is that what was intended to preserve dynasties often ended up weakening them from within. Families closed ranks too tightly, repeating the same genetic pool over generations. But for monarchs, such risks seemed worth it, because marrying a stranger, or worse, someone of lower status, was unthinkable. To them, marrying outside the family wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. A foreigner or a commoner could bring divided loyalties, foreign claims, or even political disaster. It was far safer, they believed, to keep everything in the family. Take, for instance, the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain, who would later become infamous for their genetic collapse. Long before Charles II of Spain, the dynasty had already begun the habit of cousin marrying cousin, generation after generation. Why? Because their vast empire stretched across Europe, and they wanted to keep it intact. Instead of forming risky marriages with outsiders who might claim part of the empire for themselves, they preferred to recycle their own blood. Cousins who had known each other since childhood were forced into unions that ensured the empire stayed pure. But purity came at a terrible cost. The obsession with dynastic legitimacy extended well beyond Europe. In ancient Egypt, the pharaohs practiced sibling marriages to preserve their divine aura. A pharaoh was not just a king but a god on earth, and to marry a mortal outsider would be to diminish that sacred status. By wedding their sisters, they proclaimed to the world that their line was untouchable, divine, and above the ordinary laws of men. The pharaohs saw no shame in this practice; in fact, it was celebrated as a sacred duty. Of course, modern science now reveals what such unions did to their health, but in their own time, this was seen as an act of power, not weakness. In Europe, the Catholic Church officially opposed incestuous unions, forbidding marriages between close relatives. But kings and queens had a way around this: papal dispensations. If a marriage served a higher political purpose, the Pope could simply declare it valid. Time and again, monarchs requested and received these special permissions. It is astonishing to see how the rules bent for those with crowns on their heads. Where ordinary peasants would be punished or shunned for marrying too close to kin, royals had their sins sanctified by holy decree, all in the name of political stability. At the heart of this system lay a profound contradiction. While the people were told to believe in the perfection of their rulers, behind closed doors those rulers were making decisions that would slowly erode their own health. The idea of marrying for love was almost laughable. Love was a luxury that royals could not afford. Instead, they were pawns of a machine that demanded the preservation of a myth, the myth of unbroken, sacred blood. Imagine a young princess at 16, told she must marry her uncle twice her age. Imagine a prince looking into the face of his cousin, knowing she is not his choice but his duty. These were not isolated tragedies, they were common realities. Behind the portraits of lavish weddings and golden crowns was the cold truth of sacrifice. Generations of individuals gave up personal happiness for the supposed good of their houses, never realizing they were also sowing the seeds of decline. Even when whispers of deformity, infertility, or strange illnesses began to circulate, many courts refused to acknowledge the connection to inbreeding. To admit such a thing would undermine the very foundation of their authority. Instead, they blamed witchcraft, curses, or divine punishment. Only in rare moments did the truth peek through the veil. Courtiers would whisper of strange jaws, fragile children, and endless miscarriages. But officially, the myth of purity was maintained at all costs. The deeper tragedy is that many of these unions did not even achieve the stability they promised. Wars still broke out, thrones were still lost, and blood still flowed in the streets. The very families who married within to keep power often collapsed anyway, undone by their weakened heirs or the resentment of their subjects. What was the point, one might ask, of sacrificing health and happiness for dynastic security, if that security was so often illusory? Yet generation after generation, monarchs repeated the same pattern, convinced that to marry outside was a greater risk. From the courts of Europe to the temples of Egypt, the story was the same: blood over love, duty over desire, myth over reality. And it is here, in this strange and tragic obsession, that the roots of the world's most shocking royal deformities and scandals begin. The polished portraits and gilded halls concealed a grim truth, that behind every royal marriage contract was the echo of future suffering. The kings and queens believed they were preserving themselves. In truth, they were building fragile dynasties destined to crumble. If one dynasty stands as the ultimate warning of what inbreeding can do to a royal family, it is the Habsburgs. For centuries, the name was synonymous with power, wealth, and imperial majesty. Their banners flew across Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the New World. Their marriages were carefully calculated moves that turned cousins into spouses, nieces into wives, and uncles into husbands. To outsiders, the Habsburgs seemed indestructible, an empire too vast to fail. But behind the glittering palaces and golden crowns, their bloodline was quietly collapsing. And at the center of this collapse was one man, Charles II of Spain, a king whose very body bore the weight of centuries of genetic entanglement. The story of the Habsburgs is not one of accidents or isolated unions. It was policy. They believed so deeply in preserving their house that they married each other again and again, generation after generation. Between the 1500s and 1600s, more than 90% of their marriages were between close relatives. It was not unusual for a Habsburg prince to marry his cousin, or for an emperor to take his own niece as a bride. The result was that their family tree was less a branching network and more a closed circle, looping back upon itself until it began to wither. Charles II, born in 1661, was the tragic embodiment of this strategy. From the moment of his birth, he was frail. His tongue was so large that he struggled to speak clearly, his jaw so deformed that chewing food was almost impossible. He suffered seizures, frequent illnesses, and his body remained stunted. Some said he had the mind of a child even as he grew into adulthood. But what made his condition especially devastating for Spain was that he could not produce an heir. Multiple marriages failed to yield children, and his infertility sealed the doom of the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. Portraits of Charles II show a haunting image: the infamous Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower mandible so severe that his lips could not meet. Artists tried to soften his features, but the deformity was unmistakable. This was not a quirk of one man's appearance, it was the visible result of generations of closed bloodlines. The so-called Habsburg jaw appeared again and again in the dynasty, a grotesque physical marker of their obsession with purity. But it wasn't only physical deformities. Charles II's reign was plagued by weakness and instability. His court whispered about curses, witchcraft, and even demonic possession, because no one dared admit the truth, that their king's misery was written in his DNA. Chroniclers describe him as unable to walk without assistance at times, incapable of ruling effectively, and so dependent on advisors and priests that Spain slid deeper into decline under his rule. It is a cruel irony that the very dynasty that had sought to preserve its strength through blood purity had instead engineered its own collapse. The Habsburg dynasty's downfall did not come all at once, of course. For centuries they had been Europe's great matchmakers, binding kingdoms together with marriages instead of battles. But this strategy, which had once been praised for its cunning, began to backfire. By keeping everything within the family, they left themselves no room for genetic renewal. Historians and geneticists now look back and see that Charles II's family tree was riddled with loops. His parents were uncle and niece, his grandparents were both cousins and siblings in other lines, and so on, tracing back until the same names repeat across branches. Modern studies suggest that Charles had as much genetic diversity as the child of a brother and sister. He was, in essence, the living product of a closed loop. To the Spanish people, Charles II became known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. His inability to produce an heir was seen as evidence of a curse upon the dynasty. Religious processions, prayers, and rituals were held, but none could undo the centuries of choices that had led to this moment. His death in 1700 without children triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that redrew Europe's balance of power. In the end, the Habsburgs lost control of Spain, and their once vast dynasty fractured. But the Habsburg tragedy was not confined to Spain. Across Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, the family continued its patterns of consanguineous marriages. The jawline, the infertility, and the nervous disorders repeated themselves. Some Habsburg rulers were competent despite these burdens, but the shadow of their genetic decline haunted their courts. Every new heir was scrutinized for signs of weakness, every marriage contract another spin of the wheel that might bring fortune, or further deformity. What makes the Habsburg case so haunting is the scale of their ambition. They did not marry cousins in secrecy or shame, they did so proudly, proclaiming it a mark of their unity and divine right. To them, the risks were invisible. What mattered was that no outsider could claim their throne, no foreign blood could dilute their sacred line. They believed themselves to be building an eternal empire. What they were truly building was a dynasty trapped in a genetic coffin, unable to escape its own walls. For the modern audience, it is tempting to see Charles II as a curiosity, a figure of pity or dark fascination. But in his time, he was the ruler of one of the richest empires on earth, with territory stretching to the Americas and beyond. His inability to function as a healthy man meant the machinery of state faltered. Advisors and ministers pulled strings, factions fought for influence, and the common people suffered as the monarchy decayed from within. One sickly man's struggles were not private, they rippled outward, destabilizing a continent. The story of the Habsburgs, then, is not just a tale of biology, but of politics, pride, and blindness. Their portraits hang in museums, their palaces still stand, and their names are remembered with awe. But the truth behind the grandeur is a story of fragility. The same families who ruled over millions could not escape the laws of nature. By marrying inward, they ensured not strength but collapse. And yet, even as their dynasty crumbled, the myth persisted. Court painters still tried to capture Charles II in heroic light. Priests still declared that his rule was sanctioned by God. Servants still whispered of curses instead of genetics. The illusion of power had to be maintained, even as the royal body itself betrayed the lie. The Habsburgs remind us of a chilling reality, that the pursuit of purity can destroy what it seeks to protect. Their golden thrones and crowns masked the slow erosion of their line, until all that remained was a weak king and an empire that slipped through his fingers. For all their power, they could not control the most basic force of life, the mixing of blood. And in their refusal, they carved their legacy not only in history's triumphs but in its darkest cautionary tales. If the Habsburgs embodied the visible deformities of inbreeding, Britain's royal family carried its own invisible curse, hemophilia. This genetic disorder, which prevents blood from clotting properly, became one of the most devastating legacies of the Victorian era. At its center was Queen Victoria herself, often hailed as the grandmother of Europe. Through her many children and grandchildren, she spread not only her dynasty across the continent, but also the disease that would haunt royal houses in Russia, Spain, and Germany. It was an irony so bitter that historians still marvel at it today. The very queen who united Europe through marriage also ensured that its most powerful families were tied together by a shared vulnerability. Victoria was not known to have hemophilia herself, but she carried the genetic mutation silently. One of her sons, Leopold, Duke of Albany, was affected, and several of her daughters were carriers who passed it on to their children. In an age where medical science had barely begun to understand genetics, the disease appeared like a cruel curse, striking down heirs who should have been the future of nations. Hemophilia was called the royal disease, a name both sinister and fitting. The condition itself was merciless. A small cut could lead to uncontrolled bleeding, a bruise could swell dangerously, and internal hemorrhages could cripple or kill. In an era without modern treatments, there was little that doctors could do. For the royals afflicted, every stumble, every accident carried the shadow of death. A child could be healthy one moment and gone the next. In families where heirs meant the difference between stability and chaos, this was no small matter. One of the most tragic examples was found in Russia, in the person of Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II and Alexandra, Queen Victoria's granddaughter. Alexei's hemophilia was so severe that he was often bedridden, his body covered in bruises and swollen joints from the simplest injuries. His mother's desperation for a cure led her to rely on the mystic Rasputin, whose strange influence over the family would eventually help destabilize the entire empire. A genetic disease, passed down from a British queen, thus became a factor in the fall of the Romanovs and the Russian Revolution. In Spain, Alfonso, son of Queen Victoria's granddaughter Victoria Eugenie, was another victim. His condition made it impossible for him to fulfill the robust image expected of a prince. Germany, too, saw its royal heirs weakened by the disease. It was as if Victoria's dynasty had been cursed not with deformities, as in the Habsburgs, but with fragility, their strength sapped by blood that refused to heal itself. What makes this story especially haunting is how it unfolded in silence. At the time, no one spoke openly about hemophilia. Royal families guarded their secrets closely, terrified of scandal and the political consequences of appearing weak. Newspapers painted images of strong, noble princes, while behind palace doors, families lived in constant fear of the next accident. The truth was a matter of whispered court gossip, hidden medical records, and desperate prayers. The presence of hemophilia also changed the lives of those around the afflicted heirs. Queens and princesses bore the guilt of carrying the mutation, though they could not have known it. Mothers watched helplessly as their children suffered. Fathers, who were supposed to embody strength and continuity, found themselves ruling nations with heirs who might not live to succeed them. Every illness was not just a private tragedy, but a potential crisis for an empire. The disease also highlighted the dangerous gamble of dynastic intermarriage. By marrying within a limited pool of families, the chances of spreading such genetic conditions multiplied. Queen Victoria's descendants intermarried with one another across Europe, weaving her hidden gene into the bloodlines of multiple thrones. What had once been hailed as a masterstroke of diplomacy, the uniting of Europe's monarchies under one extended family, became, in hindsight, a genetic time bomb. For the public, the truth emerged slowly. When Alexei's illness was revealed, it shocked not only Russia but the world. The image of an empire ruled by a fragile boy, whose survival depended on mystics and secrecy, undermined faith in the monarchy. Likewise, when news of hemophilia appeared in Spain and Germany, it chipped away at the illusion of divine, unbreakable rulers. The royal disease became symbolic of deeper decay. And yet, even in the face of such suffering, the old habits persisted. Royals continued to marry one another, as if chained to tradition. The belief in blood purity was stronger than the evidence of its dangers. It is perhaps one of history's most tragic ironies that monarchs, who were supposed to embody wisdom and foresight, could not see, or would not admit, that their very strategies for survival were leading them toward fragility. Today, scientists can trace the hemophilia mutation back to Queen Victoria, though debates continue about how it first appeared in her line. Some believe it was a spontaneous mutation, others wonder if it came from her ancestors. But the historical record is clear: through her children and grandchildren, the condition spread across royal Europe, weakening dynasties at the very moment they needed to project strength in a changing world. The story of hemophilia in the royal houses is not just about disease, it is about the illusion of power. Monarchs claim to be above the common people, chosen by God, immune to ordinary weaknesses. And yet, within their palaces, they bled like anyone else, sometimes fatally so. The myth of invincibility, so carefully cultivated, crumbled in the face of bruises, bandages, and funerals for children who never had a chance. The Victorian era is remembered for progress, industrial expansion, and empire. But hidden behind the grandeur was this quieter tragedy, a queen's invisible legacy, carried in the blood of her descendants. It is a story that forces us to confront the fragility of even the mightiest empires, and the inescapable truth that no crown, no throne, can protect against the forces of biology. Long before the Habsburgs and the Victorians, another dynasty turned inwards to preserve its power, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. These rulers were not merely kings in the eyes of their people, they were gods walking the earth. Their blood was believed to contain divine essence, a living link between heaven and humanity. To marry outside of that sacred line would be to pollute it, to diminish their godlike status. And so, the pharaohs took their sisters, half-sisters, and sometimes even daughters as wives, sealing their bloodlines within the narrow walls of their own households. What might appear shocking to modern eyes was, to them, a holy duty. Yet hidden beneath the gold masks and towering temples, the legacy of this practice was written on their frail bodies. Tutankhamun, the boy king who ruled more than 3,000 years ago, has become the most famous example of what inbreeding can do to a dynasty. For decades, the world knew him only as a glittering symbol, the pharaoh whose tomb was discovered filled with unimaginable treasures. But when modern science turned its gaze upon his remains, a darker truth emerged. DNA studies revealed that Tutankhamun was the child of a brother-sister union. His skeleton showed deformities, a clubfoot, cleft palate, and fragile bones. Some researchers even believe he suffered from genetic disorders that left him weak and sickly throughout his short life. The great ruler, whose name still echoes through history, may have been little more than a frail boy trapped by the weight of his ancestors' choices. For the Egyptians, however, this practice was never about cruelty, it was about divinity. By marrying sisters, the pharaohs believed they were imitating the gods themselves. Their mythology told of deities who married their siblings, keeping divine essence pure and undiluted. The pharaoh, as the earthly reflection of the gods, was expected to do the same. Each marriage within the family was not a scandal but a sacred reenactment, a performance of holiness that reinforced their claim to the throne. But the human body does not bend to myth. Over generations, the effects of incestuous unions began to appear. Some pharaohs may have been infertile, others may have suffered from illnesses that weakened their rule. Behind the polished carvings and towering statues, their daily lives were marked by frailty. The people worshipped them as living gods, yet even gods could not escape the hidden toll of their own traditions. The tragedy is that these rulers believed themselves to be preserving strength. In reality, they were sealing their line's weakness. When Tutankhamun died suddenly at the age of 19, his dynasty came to an end. His death was not just a personal loss but a political disaster, throwing Egypt into turmoil. Behind the golden mask that so captivated the world lay a young man crushed by centuries of divine expectations and genetic fragility. His story is less one of glory and more one of human vulnerability, hidden behind symbols of eternal power. And Tutankhamun was not the only one. Scholars point to other royal mummies showing signs of deformities and diseases, hints of the same closed breeding practices repeated again and again. These physical traces, preserved for millennia, speak more honestly than the grand inscriptions ever did. The temples proclaimed eternal strength, the bones whispered the truth of decay. What makes the Egyptian case especially fascinating is the contrast between image and reality. The pharaohs presented themselves to their people as immortal, flawless, perfect in body and spirit. The colossal statues, the divine titles, the rituals of worship, all of it was theater to maintain the illusion of godhood. Yet in private, many of them lived with bodies that betrayed weakness, illnesses that made walking painful, and lifespans cut brutally short. The very system meant to preserve their divinity ensured their humanity was marked by suffering. The secrecy of the court helped preserve the illusion. Common Egyptians never knew the full extent of their rulers' ailments. A limp might be hidden behind grand processions, a frail voice might be masked by priests who spoke on the king's behalf. What mattered was that the pharaoh appeared as the embodiment of divine order, no matter what personal torment lay beneath the golden crown. Today, with CT scans and DNA testing, we see what the Egyptians never admitted: their gods were fragile, their dynasties brittle. The tomb of Tutankhamun, once hailed as the discovery of eternal glory, has become instead a case study in the dangers of inbreeding. The treasures that dazzled the world now sit beside evidence of disease and genetic collapse. The boy who wore the mask of a god may have limped through his short life in pain, unable to walk unaided, his fate sealed before he was ever born. The story of Egypt's pharaohs is not simply one of ancient ritual but of universal human folly, the belief that power can defy nature. The kings of the Nile believed their divine blood would make them eternal. Instead, it made them vulnerable, fragile, and often doomed. Their monuments endure, their names remain carved into stone, but their bodies tell a different tale. And it is in those silent bones, preserved by desert sands, that we see the cost of their obsession with sacred blood. From the banks of the Nile to the corridors of European palaces centuries later, the pattern repeats: rulers convinced of their superiority, willing to sacrifice love, health, and even survival to preserve a myth. The pharaohs remind us that even the most powerful empires can be undone by what lies beneath their crowns. The gods they claimed to be were, in the end, only human, and tragically so. If the pharaohs of Egypt wrapped their weakness in divine myth and the Habsburgs wore their deformities on their faces, the Russian Tsars carried their curse in blood that could not heal. The Romanov dynasty, which ruled one of the largest empires the world has ever seen, found itself undone not by armies or invasions, but by a disease carried silently through generations: hemophilia. And at the center of this story was a single boy, Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, whose fragile body became a symbol of both royal desperation and the cracks forming within an empire. Alexei, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, was born in 1904. From the moment he entered the world, the entire empire's future rested on his tiny shoulders. Russia was a land of immense size, ruled by autocracy, where stability depended on a clear and strong heir. But within months, Alexandra realized something was terribly wrong with her beloved son. Small bruises would swell into dangerous wounds. Bleeding from the slightest injury would not stop. The doctors whispered what no royal family wanted to hear: Alexei had hemophilia, the royal disease, carried down from his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. For the Romanovs, this was more than a personal tragedy. Alexei's condition was a state secret. If the people knew their heir was so frail, so close to death at every stumble, the monarchy's image of divine strength would shatter. And so the illness was hidden behind palace doors, spoken of only in whispers. The boy himself, however, could not hide it. He often lay bedridden for weeks, his joints swollen with internal bleeding, his face pale with suffering. At times, he came close to death, his parents watching helplessly as doctors failed again and again to save him. It was in this atmosphere of despair that Alexandra turned to a man who would change Russian history: Grigory Rasputin. The mystic from Siberia, unwashed and half-worshipped as a holy man, seemed to possess a mysterious ability to ease Alexei's suffering. When the boy was in agony, Rasputin would pray, speak softly, and somehow the bleeding would slow. Science could not explain it. Perhaps his calm presence reduced stress, or perhaps it was coincidence. But to Alexandra, it was a miracle. She believed Rasputin had been sent by God to save her son. This belief gave Rasputin immense influence over the royal family. His presence in the palace scandalized the nobility and enraged the public, who saw him as a charlatan corrupting the throne. Yet Alexandra clung to him, convinced that without him, Alexei would die. Thus, a genetic disease carried by one boy brought a wandering mystic into the very heart of Russian power. And through him, trust in the monarchy began to erode. The presence of hemophilia in the Romanov family highlighted the dangers of dynastic intermarriage. Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, had unknowingly carried the mutation in her blood. By marrying her cousin Nicholas, she brought the hidden defect into Russia's imperial line. What might have been a minor tragedy in another family became, in this case, a crisis for an entire empire. The fate of millions of Russians was entangled with the fragile veins of a child who could not survive the smallest fall. Alexei's illness also changed the dynamics of the royal household. Nicholas, already seen as a weak ruler, became distracted by his son's condition, while Alexandra withdrew further into her faith and her reliance on Rasputin. Ministers grew frustrated, nobles grew suspicious, and the people, already suffering under war and poverty, began to see the monarchy as incompetent and cursed. Every rumor of the boy's sickness, every story of Rasputin's influence, chipped away at the sacred image of the Tsar as God's chosen ruler. By the time the First World War broke out, the Russian monarchy was already fragile. When soldiers died at the front and bloodlines formed in the cities, people whispered that the empire was ruled by a sickly boy and a foreign-born empress under the spell of a mad monk. It was not just propaganda, it was partly true. A child's illness had shaken the very foundations of the throne. The tragedy of Alexei is not only his suffering but the way his condition became a symbol of the Romanovs' decline. Here was a boy who should have embodied the future, yet instead embodied weakness. His bloodline, meant to carry divine legitimacy, instead carried fragility. His suffering, hidden yet omnipresent, became a metaphor for an empire on the verge of collapse. In 1917, revolution swept Russia, and the Romanovs were overthrown. Alexei, still only 13, was executed with his family in 1918. He died not as the Tsar he was meant to become, but as a frail boy whose every stumble had once terrified a dynasty. His hemophilia, in some ways, had already killed the monarchy long before the firing squad. The disease had eroded trust, empowered Rasputin, and exposed the weaknesses of an empire that could no longer sustain itself. The Romanov story is a chilling reminder that inbreeding and genetic fragility were not just private tragedies within royal households. They were matters of state, capable of reshaping the destinies of entire nations. A single gene, carried down from Queen Victoria, helped destabilize the Russian Empire and hastened its fall. What began as a hidden defect in the blood of a child became a crack that widened into revolution. And in the end, the Romanovs, like the Habsburgs and the pharaohs before them, proved that no throne, no crown, no empire is immune from the forces of nature. Behind the walls of palaces, beneath the illusion of power, their blood told a different story, one of fragility, secrecy, and decline. If the Romanovs bled in silence and the Habsburgs wore their deformities on their faces, the Bourbons carried a quieter curse, instability of the mind and body that haunted their courts for centuries. This powerful dynasty, which ruled France and Spain at different times, built palaces of dazzling grandeur, projected the image of absolute monarchy, and proclaimed themselves chosen to rule. Yet behind the glittering mirrors of Versailles and the painted faces of Spanish kings lurked whispers of weakness, madness, and decline. The Bourbons, too, became victims of their own closed marriages and entanglements with other dynasties, particularly the Habsburgs. Their quest for purity and power would end up creating kings who were fragile in health, fragile in will, and at times fragile in mind. The French branch of the Bourbons is often remembered through Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose reign represented the peak of royal absolutism. But by the time of his successors, cracks had begun to appear. Louis XV and Louis XVI inherited not only the throne but also the weight of a dynasty already carrying centuries of cousin marriages and entangled bloodlines. Louis XVI, the last Bourbon king of France before the Revolution, struggled not with deformities as obvious as Charles II of Spain, but with infertility and indecision that weakened his rule. His inability to produce an heir for several years after marrying Marie Antoinette became a matter of public gossip, fueling scandal and undermining his authority. Though not directly caused by hemophilia or deformity, his struggles reflected the same patterns of dynastic fragility that haunted Europe's royal houses. But it was in Spain that the Bourbon dynasty's decline became most visible. After the death of Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler, the War of the Spanish Succession placed a Bourbon, Philip V, on the throne. He was the grandson of Louis XIV, uniting the two great dynasties of Europe. Yet the very blood that tied him to glory also carried with it weakness. Philip V suffered from bouts of severe depression, paranoia, and lethargy that left him unable to govern effectively. His reign was marked by repeated withdrawals from public life, where he would confine himself to his rooms, refusing to dress or eat. Ministers and his wife often had to coax him into performing even the simplest royal duties. The image of a monarch chosen by God was undermined by the reality of a man too paralyzed by his own mind to rule. His descendants fared little better. Ferdinand VI, his son, was known for melancholy and instability. After the death of his beloved wife, he descended into deep depression, withdrawing completely from public life and dying broken in spirit. Charles IV, another Bourbon king of Spain, was mocked for his incompetence and manipulation by his ambitious wife and her favorite, Godoy. By the time Napoleon invaded Spain in the early 19th century, the Bourbon monarchy was already hollowed out, led by rulers whose weakness was both political and personal. The Bourbon tragedy lay not only in the health of individual kings but in the pattern that repeated itself across generations: fragile heirs, unstable minds, and rulers unable to meet the demands of their turbulent times. Intermarriage with the Habsburgs had introduced traits of physical and mental weakness, and the closed circles of dynastic unions only deepened the risks. Where the French Bourbons faltered in producing heirs and projecting authority, the Spanish Bourbons faltered in sustaining rulers who could even function day to day. To their subjects, the contrast was glaring. The palaces of Versailles and Madrid projected eternal strength and divine order, yet their kings were often figures of ridicule or pity. Court gossip circulated endlessly about royal eccentricities, whispered stories of kings who trembled, wept, or raved in private while presenting stiff faces in public. For common people struggling with poverty and war, these weaknesses fed disillusionment. How could such men truly be chosen by God to rule? How could dynasties so obsessed with purity end up producing rulers who seemed so far from the ideals they proclaimed? The Bourbons' decline also reveals the broader consequences of inbreeding and insularity. The problem was not only physical disease but the erosion of resilience. Monarchs who inherited fragile constitutions struggled under the immense pressure of absolute power. The political system demanded stability, decisiveness, and strength, but the dynastic system produced hesitation, fragility, and collapse. By the late 18th century in France and the early 19th century in Spain, the Bourbon name no longer commanded awe, it invited mockery and rebellion. And yet, as with the Habsburgs and Romanovs, the myth persisted. Portraits painted kings in strong, regal poses. Ceremony surrounded them with pomp and splendor. The Bourbon name was still spoken with reverence in official decrees. But beneath the surface, the dynasty was decaying. In France, it collapsed entirely under the weight of revolution and the guillotine. In Spain, it staggered through invasions, abdications, and humiliations. The Bourbon tragedy was not as grotesque as the Habsburg jaw or as dramatic as Rasputin's grip on Russia, but it was just as destructive. It was the quiet unraveling of a dynasty that believed itself eternal, undone not by outside enemies but by the frailty of its own heirs. The Bourbons remind us that royal decline does not always come in explosions of deformity or scandal. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in kings who cannot rise from bed, in rulers who shrink from duty, in dynasties that slowly lose the respect of their people. Their tragedy was not one of monstrous appearances, but of invisible weakness that hollowed out the monarchy from within. And in the end, the result was the same: collapse, rebellion, and the shattering of a myth that had lasted for centuries. Far from the castles of Europe and the palaces of Spain, on the islands of the Pacific, another kind of royalty preserved its bloodline through the same dangerous practice. In Hawaii and other Polynesian societies, rulers were seen not merely as chiefs or monarchs, but as sacred beings, living vessels of divine power known as mana. Their blood was not just political, it was holy. And so, to keep it pure, they too turned inward, marrying brothers to sisters, cousins to cousins, and binding their families in unions meant to protect a spiritual inheritance. What they sought was not political alliances across borders, but the preservation of sacred authority within their islands. Yet the result, as with the dynasties of Europe, was a fragility written in their bodies and their histories. In Hawaiian tradition, the highest-ranking marriages were often between siblings of noble birth. Such unions were considered sacred, producing offspring of the highest spiritual rank, known as Aniopio. These children were believed to embody the strongest concentration of divine mana, destined to rule over their people with unquestioned authority. To the common eye, such marriages may appear shocking, but in the Hawaiian worldview, they were acts of preservation, acts meant to protect the spiritual thread connecting rulers to gods. A king or queen born of such a union was considered untouchable, higher even than other nobles, an almost godlike figure among mortals. But biology, indifferent to myth, played its cruel hand. As these closed unions repeated across generations, signs of genetic weakness began to appear. Infertility plagued some noble lines, and fragile health became an unspoken reality in others. Though the historical record is less medically precise than in Europe, the parallels are hard to miss. Sacred blood, kept within sacred lines, became a double-edged sword, bestowing spiritual legitimacy while planting the seeds of decline. Across Polynesia, similar practices took root. In Tahiti and other island kingdoms, sibling marriages among chiefs were celebrated, even sung about in chants and remembered as holy. The reasoning was consistent: the closer the blood, the greater the divine essence. But isolation magnified the risks. These were islands separated by vast oceans, where the ruling families already had limited pools of marriageable nobles. Over time, the genetic circle tightened, leaving rulers vulnerable to the same consequences that befell their European counterparts. What makes the Polynesian case striking is the openness with which these practices were celebrated. In Europe, cousin marriages and incestuous unions were often cloaked in political justification or hidden behind papal dispensations. In the Pacific, they were central to ritual and myth, declared as sacred duties performed for the good of the people. To question them was to question the divine order itself. The king and queen were embodiments of gods, and their union, however close the relation, was a holy reenactment of creation itself. Yet beneath this sacred theater, human costs remained. For every ruler celebrated as a child of divine union, there were whispers of heirs who struggled, families who dwindled, and dynasties that ended abruptly. Fragile health, stillbirths, and weakness were part of the hidden fabric of these royal lines. In societies where oral tradition carried memory, such stories often survived as hints, woven into chants and legends that spoke of rulers both mighty and frail. When Europeans arrived in the Pacific and encountered these practices, they were horrified, branding them as immoral. But they failed to understand the deep spiritual framework that justified them. To Hawaiians and Polynesians, these marriages were not scandal, they were sacred preservation of authority in a fragile world. And in that sense, they mirror perfectly the dynasties of Europe, who cloaked their incestuous unions in the language of purity, divine right, and dynastic survival. Across oceans and cultures, the logic was the same, though the costumes and rituals differed. The decline of Polynesian monarchies in the 19th century was not caused directly by inbreeding, it came through colonization, disease, and foreign conquest. But within the lines of their sacred blood, fragility lingered. By the time Hawaii's last monarch, Queen Liliuokalani, struggled against the overthrow of her kingdom, her family's lineage had already been thinned by centuries of closed unions. The great sacred bloodlines that had once made kings and queens untouchable were, by then, a fragile inheritance, as vulnerable to collapse as any empire in Europe. The story of Hawaiian and Polynesian royals reminds us that the obsession with blood purity is not confined to one culture or continent. Across the world, in societies separated by oceans and centuries, rulers convinced themselves that purity brought power. And in each case, the result was the same: fragile dynasties burdened with the unseen costs of their own choices. Whether cloaked in the language of divine manna or divine right, the pursuit of purity always came with a hidden price. Behind the portraits of kings and queens, behind the heavy crowns and glittering jewels, there was a private world rarely spoken of in official histories. It was the everyday life of the inbred elite, a life marked not only by luxury and ceremony, but by frailty, secrecy, and quiet suffering. These royal households projected perfection to their subjects. But within the palace walls, the truth was often more unsettling. Generations of closed marriages had left many rulers and their children living lives shadowed by disease, deformity, and despair. Imagine the courts of Europe at their height: grand banquets, endless ceremonies, and rooms filled with courtiers dressed in the finest silks. To an outsider, these were worlds of power and magnificence. Yet within those same halls, some of the most powerful people on earth struggled with basic tasks. Charles II of Spain, with his enlarged tongue and twisted jaw, had to be spoon-fed like a child, unable to chew his food. He drooled during conversations, his words slurred beyond recognition. Servants learned to anticipate his difficulties, rushing forward with cloths to wipe his mouth before guests could notice. To the world, he was a king ordained by God; to those in his household, he was a fragile man dependent on constant care. Life for the heirs of such dynasties could be just as bleak. Young boys born with hemophilia, like Alexei Romanov, lived under constant supervision. Play, the simple joy of childhood, was almost forbidden. A stumble on the stairs, a bruise from a wooden toy, could lead to days of agony or even death. Every fall brought terror into the hearts of their mothers, who watched with dread for the telltale swelling that meant internal bleeding. Nannies, servants, and guards hovered constantly, turning carefree royal childhoods into suffocating prisons of precaution. The laughter of princes was often stifled by whispered warnings: "Careful, careful, you must not hurt yourself." For queens and princesses, the burden of inbreeding was often infertility or endless miscarriages. The pressure on royal women to produce heirs was immense, yet many struggled, their bodies weakened by generations of genetic entanglement. Behind the gilded bedchambers, tears flowed silently as pregnancies ended in stillbirths or children died in infancy. Courtiers whispered of curses, of God's displeasure, or of witchcraft, never daring to suggest the true cause. To speak of inbreeding was taboo; it threatened the very foundation of dynastic legitimacy. And so mothers carried the weight of guilt, believing themselves cursed, while the true curse lay in the blood they had inherited. Even those who lived into adulthood often endured lives of secrecy and shame. Some royals were hidden away, their conditions concealed from the public. In smaller German duchies, deformed heirs were quietly kept out of sight, their existence acknowledged only within palace walls. Courtiers crafted official stories, painting these families as flawless, while in reality fragile sons and daughters sat behind closed doors, denied the chance to be seen, their very presence considered a threat to dynastic image. Daily life for the inbred elite was also shaped by medical superstition. Physicians, lacking modern knowledge, prescribed bizarre treatments to alleviate their ailments. Bleeding, purging, and dangerous potions were common. Charles II of Spain was subjected to endless rituals meant to balance his humors. Hemophiliac princes were wrapped in herbs and prayed over by priests, while desperate queens clung to holy relics in the hope that divine intervention would succeed where medicine failed. The result was often not relief but further suffering, as fragile bodies endured both illness and the brutal remedies intended to cure them. The psychological weight of these hidden realities should not be underestimated. Kings raised to believe themselves divine often faced the humiliating truth of their own weakness. Charles II could barely rule, relying entirely on ministers, his sense of inadequacy gnawing at him. Philip V of Spain, haunted by depression, would refuse to leave his bed for days, sometimes weeks, his court paralyzed by his absence. Even rulers not visibly deformed often lived with the quiet knowledge of fragility, the whispered doubts of courtiers, and the ever-present fear that their line might end with them. Yet the illusion had to be maintained. Public life was carefully choreographed to conceal weakness. Portraits were commissioned to show strength and vigor, even if the subject could barely stand. Speeches were written and delivered by ministers in the monarch's name, masking slurred voices or absent minds. Banquets were staged where a king might appear briefly before retreating to his rooms, his absence explained away with excuses of piety or privacy. For subjects, the myth of divine blood endured, but for servants and courtiers who lived close to the royal body, the truth was undeniable. The courtiers themselves were complicit in this illusion. They were trained to ignore what they saw, to bow and flatter, to pretend that weakness was strength. To serve at a court like Spain's under Charles II was to live in a strange theater where everyone knew the king was sickly, yet no one dared to say it. Silence became a duty, and deception a form of loyalty. The higher the crown was raised, the more carefully its cracks had to be hidden. Beyond Europe, similar scenes unfolded. In the sacred households of Polynesian royals, children born of sibling marriages were treated as divine beings, yet some were frail and ill. Their struggles were cloaked in rituals, their deaths woven into chants of sacred mystery rather than spoken of as consequences of human choices. Across cultures, the story was the same, weakness masked by ceremony, fragility wrapped in sacred myth. What emerges from these glimpses of daily life is a haunting paradox. These families had everything, wealth beyond imagining, palaces filled with servants, the devotion of entire nations, yet they lacked the one thing most ordinary people took for granted, robust health and the freedom to live without fear of their own blood. Their lives, for all their opulence, were lives of quiet suffering, bound by chains invisible to their subjects. In the end, the everyday existence of the inbred elite was not the life of gods, but the life of prisoners, prisoners of tradition, of blood, of secrecy. They smiled in portraits and waved from balconies, but behind closed doors they lived with pain, with fear, with the constant reminder that their own bodies were the price of their family's obsession with purity. It is in these hidden moments, the spoon-fed king, the bleeding prince, the grieving queen, that the true cost of dynastic ambition is revealed. So far, we have traced the great tragedies of famous dynasties, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the Bourbons. But not all stories of inbreeding belong to the largest thrones of Europe. Scattered across smaller kingdoms and duchies are tales just as strange, just as dark, and sometimes even more bizarre. These lesser-known cases, hidden in the margins of history, reveal that the obsession with blood purity was not confined to the mighty empires. From Portugal to Bavaria, from obscure German duchies to Italian courts, royal families repeatedly turned inward, and the results were often grotesque, tragic, or simply strange enough to sound like legend. One of the most striking examples comes from Portugal, where the royal family was notorious for its cousin marriages. Generations of Portuguese monarchs intermarried within their own bloodline or with Spanish Habsburgs, ensuring that the genetic risks multiplied. The result was a line of rulers often plagued by physical weakness and early death. King Afonso VI, for example, who ruled in the 17th century, was paralyzed on one side of his body from childhood and mentally unstable. He was so incapable of ruling that his wife sought annulment, claiming their marriage had never been consummated. For a kingdom that looked to its monarch for leadership in a dangerous age of colonial rivalry, such weakness at the top was devastating. In Bavaria, the Wittelsbach family offers another disturbing example. They were known across Europe not for their physical deformities but for their mental instability. Madness seemed to run in their line, appearing in generation after generation. One of the most famous was King Ludwig II, remembered today as the Mad King of Bavaria, whose obsession with building fantastical castles bankrupted his kingdom. His retreat into a dream world of architecture and opera reflected the fragile mental state that haunted his family. Though admired today for his romantic vision, in his time he was seen as unstable, unfit to rule, and a symbol of a dynasty unraveling from within. Behind him stretched a long history of Wittelsbach's suffering from paranoia, melancholy, and breakdowns, legacies of generations of close marriages within the same noble houses. Even smaller German duchies reveal tales that seem more fitting for Gothic novels than history books. In some cases, royal lines collapsed entirely because the pool of eligible nobles was simply too small. Cousins married cousins until there was no healthy heir left, and the line died out. Chroniclers wrote of frail children, endless stillbirths, and rulers who could not speak clearly or walk unaided. These families, desperate to preserve their titles and lands, ended up extinguishing themselves by closing the circle too tightly. Their castles still stand, silent monuments to dynasties that folded inward until there was nothing left. In Italy, whispers of inbreeding also colored the reputations of noble houses. Some dukes and princes became infamous for their eccentricities, their cruelty, or their decline into paranoia. Chroniclers at the time often explained these behaviors as moral failings or divine punishment, but modern historians see the patterns more clearly. The same marriages, repeated within the same circles, produced rulers who were brilliant at times but more often unstable, ill, or incapable of sustaining their power. What makes these lesser-known cases especially eerie is how little they were spoken of publicly. Unlike the Habsburgs, who left behind portraits that revealed their jawlines to all of Europe, or the Romanovs, whose downfall made Alexei's hemophilia world-famous, these smaller dynasties tried to bury their scandals. In dusty archives, hidden correspondence, and half-forgotten medical records, we glimpse the truth. Servants wrote of strange behaviors, priests hinted at secret illnesses, and visiting diplomats described courts where heirs seemed more like invalids than rulers. Sometimes the results of inbreeding were not tragic so much as grotesquely absurd. In certain lines, rulers became obsessed with bizarre fixations, strange diets, compulsive behaviors, or eccentric rituals, that courtiers tolerated because they dared not offend their monarchs. These stories survive as anecdotes in memoirs and travelogues, tiny windows into courts where the line between power and madness blurred. To outsiders, they seemed like tales of exotic absurdity. To those who lived under them, they were daily reality. What unites all these hidden stories is the same pattern we have seen in the great empires, the illusion of strength masking deep fragility. Whether in Lisbon, Munich, or some forgotten duchy along the Rhine, rulers convinced themselves that marrying within their own circles would secure their power. Instead, it eroded them. The faces of these monarchs rarely make it into the grand history books, overshadowed by their more famous counterparts. Yet their stories are just as chilling, because they show that inbreeding was not a rare mistake of one or two dynasties, it was a widespread practice, repeated across Europe for centuries, each time carrying the same hidden costs. These lesser-known cases also remind us that the suffering was not confined to the monarchs themselves. Whole kingdoms bore the consequences of their rulers' fragility. When a king could not govern, ministers and foreign powers stepped in, often plunging countries into crisis. When dynasties died out, wars of succession tore through Europe. The private tragedies of inbred rulers became public disasters for their people. In the end, the weird, dark, and forgotten tales of Europe's smaller dynasties add depth to the larger story. They show that the obsession with blood purity was not only a habit of the mighty Habsburgs or Bourbons, but a pattern woven into the very fabric of monarchy itself. Wherever rulers believed their blood was divine, wherever they married kin to preserve it, the results were the same: fragile heirs, whispered scandals, and dynasties destined to crumble. For centuries, royal families built their lives around myths of purity. They told their people that their blood was sacred, their lineage chosen by God, their crowns eternal because their veins carried something more than human. The public saw kings and queens as flawless, semi-divine beings whose marriages bound empires and whose children guaranteed stability. Yet beneath this glittering story lay another truth, one that only modern science has fully revealed: the myth of blood purity was a slow-acting poison. What rulers thought would preserve them was, in reality, eroding them from within. In the world of myth, purity meant strength. In the world of biology, purity meant risk. When people from the same family marry and have children, they increase the chances that harmful recessive genes, mutations carried silently in every bloodline, will meet. In ordinary circumstances, these mutations are often hidden, passed quietly from parent to child without consequence. But when both parents carry the same mutation, their children have a far greater chance of suffering its effects. Over time, repeated unions within the same bloodline stack these risks higher and higher, until deformities, diseases, and infertility become inevitable. This is what happened to Europe's Habsburgs. Modern genetic studies of their family tree reveal a level of inbreeding so severe that by the time of Charles II of Spain, his genetic diversity was equivalent to the child of a brother and sister. His famous jaw, his infertility, his seizures, all of it can be traced back to centuries of cousin marriages and uncle-niece unions. The family's obsession with keeping their empire intact had, quite literally, eaten away at the health of their line. The myth of divine right could not cover the reality of biology. The same science explains the royal disease of hemophilia that plagued Victoria's descendants. Hemophilia is caused by a genetic mutation carried on the X chromosome. Women can carry it silently, unaffected themselves, but they pass it to their sons, who have only one X chromosome and therefore no protection against the disease. This is why Queen Victoria's daughters became carriers, and why her grandsons suffered. In the past, people saw this as a curse, a punishment, or the will of God. Today, we know it was the simple, tragic mathematics of genetics at work, magnified by repeated intermarriage within Europe's royal houses. What makes this contrast so striking is how long the myths endured even in the face of evidence. Courtiers and priests blamed witchcraft, divine anger, or even demons for the ailments of their rulers. When Charles II of Spain struggled to speak and could not produce children, his advisors ordered exorcisms, believing him bewitched. When Alexei Romanov suffered his agonizing bleeds, his mother turned to Rasputin, convinced of his mystical healing powers. The truth, that their suffering was written into their blood, was unimaginable in their world. To admit it would have been to shatter the foundation of monarchy itself. Modern science now allows us to peel back the illusions and see these rulers not as cursed or bewitched, but as victims of a system that defied nature. DNA analysis of royal remains, like that of Tutankhamun, confirms what ancient myths had obscured. His body bore the hallmarks of a brother-sister union, his fragile bones and deformities proof of what the Egyptians refused to see. The gods they imitated in their marriages did not protect them from biology. The pharaoh's divine blood was no shield against the laws of inheritance. Even today, the science of inbreeding offers a sobering perspective on these myths. Studies of animal populations show the same effects: reduced fertility, increased birth defects, weakened immune systems. Nature demands diversity to remain strong. By closing their lines, monarchs created the very weakness they sought to avoid. The science is clear: purity does not mean strength, it means vulnerability. And yet, these rulers clung to their myths. They believed that by keeping their blood untainted, they were securing their future. The Habsburgs believed they were preserving their empire. The pharaohs believed they were preserving divinity. The Bourbons believed they were preserving authority. Each of them, in their own way, were preserving fragility instead. Science now unmasks what history once whispered, that the obsession with purity was the slow undoing of dynasties. The contrast between myth and science also reveals something deeper about human nature. Across cultures, people have long equated purity with strength, whether in religion, tradition, or politics. But the truth is the opposite. Strength comes from diversity, from mixing, from openness. It is a lesson written into our very DNA, and one that history's rulers ignored at their peril. Their myths built empires, but their blood brought them down. Perhaps the most haunting part of this revelation is the silence of those who suffered. Charles II could not have understood why his body betrayed him. Alexei Romanov could not have known why he bled so easily. Tutankhamun could not have known why his bones were weak. To them, it was fate, mystery, or divine punishment. Only now can we see the clarity they lacked. Only now can we say with certainty, their tragedies were not curses, not witchcraft, not the wrath of gods. They were the inevitable outcome of choices made by their ancestors, repeated across generations, hidden beneath crowns and ceremonies. The myths of purity still dazzle in paintings, statues, and golden tombs. But the science strips away the illusion, leaving us with a stark truth. The kings and queens who believed themselves above ordinary men and women were, in fact, trapped by the same natural laws as everyone else. No amount of ritual, wealth, or divine proclamation could change what was written in their blood. And in the end, it was this collision, myth against science, illusion against biology, that shaped the destinies of some of the most powerful families in history. By the 20th century, the world's monarchies faced a choice: adapt or perish. The old obsession with blood purity had already toppled or weakened dynasties from Spain to Russia. The tragedies of Charles II, Alexei Romanov, and countless forgotten heirs had shown, in stark detail, the cost of inbreeding. Those who survived into the modern age learned a hard lesson: if they wished their lines to endure, they could no longer close their circles. The age of marrying cousins and nieces was coming to an end. But the question remains: did they truly learn from history, or have the lessons been only partly understood? In Britain, the House of Windsor transformed itself by embracing something unthinkable in earlier centuries: marriage to commoners. King George VI, father of Elizabeth II, married Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, a Scottish noblewoman outside the tight circle of European royals. Their union represented a quiet break from centuries of dynastic entanglement. Decades later, Queen Elizabeth II's children continued this path. Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer, not a royal but a member of the aristocracy. Prince William, heir to the throne, went even further, marrying Catherine Middleton, a woman with no aristocratic background at all. For the British monarchy, this shift was more than symbolic, it was survival. By opening their bloodlines, they stepped away from the genetic traps that had haunted their ancestors. Other monarchies followed similar paths. The kings of Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands also married outside the traditional royal pool, sometimes scandalizing their families but ultimately ensuring healthier heirs. Marriages that would once have been condemned as beneath a royal are now celebrated as signs of modernity, proof that monarchies can adapt to a democratic age. Where once crowns rested on fragile heads, today's royal children run, play, and laugh without the constant shadow of inherited disease. And yet, even as modern royals embrace change, traces of the old obsession linger. Bloodlines still matter, even if not as rigidly as before. Monarchies remain careful about appearances, mindful that legitimacy in the eyes of their people still depends, in part, on tradition and heritage. A prince or princess marrying a commoner is accepted today, but there are still unspoken rules about dignity, reputation, and suitable partners. The chains of blood may be looser, but they have not been broken entirely. There are also shadows that continue to haunt. Genetic studies have shown that Europe's royal families remain more interlinked than most populations, a legacy of centuries of cousin marriages. Though the risks are greatly reduced by modern unions, the echoes of the past remain in the genealogies. The very idea of monarchy, that families pass power through blood, still binds these institutions to the notion of purity, even as they try to modernize. In some monarchies, the refusal to fully adapt has come at a cost. In the Middle East, for example, cousin marriages remain far more common within ruling families. While the cultural framework differs from Europe's past, the risks are the same. Reports of genetic disorders among Gulf royalty hint that the lessons of the Habsburgs and Bourbons may not have been fully learned. Even in Europe, whispers of genetic fragility sometimes resurface, though modern medicine now hides much of what once would have been obvious. But the deeper change may not lie in bloodlines at all, it lies in the way monarchies present themselves. In the age of mass media, the illusion of divine perfection has shifted into the illusion of relatability. Modern royals pose for family photos, appear on television, and project themselves as ordinary parents, raising ordinary children in extraordinary circumstances. The golden masks of pharaohs have given way to Instagram posts and royal weddings broadcast to millions. The myth has changed, but the need for myth remains. Where once it was the myth of purity, today it is the myth of modernity. And so we arrive at a strange paradox. The monarchies that survive today are, in many ways, healthier and stronger because they have abandoned the obsession with marrying only their kin. They have broken the genetic loop that destroyed the Habsburgs and cursed the Romanovs. Yet they remain institutions built on bloodlines, still telling their people that their right to rule is inherited, not earned. The past may no longer be repeating in deformities and bleeding heirs, but the shadow of that history hangs over them still. For the casual observer, today's princes and princesses appear far removed from the grotesque tragedies of Charles II or the fragile suffering of Alexei. But look closer, and the line is unbroken. The same crowns rest on their heads, the same myths sustain their thrones. The difference is that, this time, science and survival have forced adaptation. The lesson has been learned, not perfectly, not universally, but enough to keep the remaining monarchies alive in an age that has little patience for weakness. What remains, perhaps, is a haunting reminder: if they ever forget these lessons, if they ever turn inward again, the ghosts of their ancestors stand ready as a warning. The faces of the past, the drooping jaw of Charles II, the pale body of Alexei, the fragile bones of Tutankhamun, are silent testimonies to what happens when myths of purity collide with the laws of nature. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem is one of the most contested and mysterious pieces of ground on earth. For Jews, it is the site of Solomon's and Herod's temples, the beating heart of their ancient faith. For Muslims, it is the Haram al-Sharif, crowned by the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven. For Christians, it is a place woven into biblical history, shadowed by prophets, kings, and miracles. But for the Knights Templar, this sacred plateau became something else entirely, a vault of hidden secrets, a gateway to forbidden knowledge, and the very foundation of their legendary mystique. When Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, granted the Templars quarters within the Al-Aqsa Mosque around 1119, the move seemed practical. The fledgling order needed a headquarters, and the massive structure, built by Muslims in the late 7th century, stood upon the very ruins of Solomon's Temple. For medieval minds, this was no ordinary real estate. This was holy ground layered with centuries of myth. And the Templars, sworn guardians of Christendom, suddenly found themselves living atop one of the most enigmatic sites in human history. Almost immediately, rumors began to swirl. Pilgrims whispered that the Templars were not just knights but secret excavators, tunneling beneath the sacred mount. Chroniclers spoke of strange digging operations, of earth being hauled out under the cover of night. Some claimed they sought hidden treasure, others believed they searched for relics of unimaginable power. Whatever they were doing, it was not simply guarding pilgrims. Something deeper was at work. What could they have been looking for? Theories abound, and they range from the plausible to the fantastical. One possibility is that they sought the fabled treasures of the Temple of Solomon, golden artifacts plundered by the Babylonians in 586 BCE and thought to have vanished forever. Chief among them was the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest said to hold the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. To medieval Christians, recovering such a relic would have been the ultimate triumph, proof that God had chosen them as his new people. Others whisper of the Holy Grail, the chalice said to have caught Christ's blood at the crucifixion. Though the Grail legend would not take full shape until centuries later, early forms of the story were already circulating in Europe during the Templars' time. Could the knights have been its hidden keepers? Still others suggest the Templars unearthed forbidden scrolls, ancient texts buried deep beneath the Temple Mount. These writings, some speculate, contained heretical knowledge, secrets of Jewish mysticism, early Christian gospels long suppressed, or even wisdom from older civilizations lost to time. To their enemies, this became a convenient explanation for the accusations of heresy that would later destroy them. To their admirers, it was evidence that the Templars were more than warriors, they were guardians of forgotten truths. Modern archaeology has added fuel to these fires. Excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed that indeed, a network of tunnels and passages lies beneath the Temple Mount. Some of them date back to the time of Herod, others to later centuries. These discoveries prove that subterranean exploration is possible and that such digging would not have been beyond the reach of determined medieval knights. Even today, much of the area beneath the mount remains off-limits, shrouded in secrecy, its mysteries unresolved. One intriguing clue comes from the Copper Scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in the mid-20th century. Unlike the others, which contain religious writings, the Copper Scroll is essentially a treasure map. It lists dozens of hidden caches of gold and silver, supposedly buried around Jerusalem during the Roman wars of the 1st century. Some have speculated that the Templars, digging under the Temple Mount, may have stumbled upon this ancient knowledge or even the treasure itself. But treasure alone cannot explain the enduring aura of secrecy. Many historians argue that what the Templars may have uncovered was not simply wealth, but knowledge. During their years in the East, they encountered Islamic scholars who preserved the wisdom of the Greeks, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine that Europe had largely forgotten. Combined with whatever they may have found beneath the Temple Mount, the Templars could have possessed a library of insight centuries ahead of their time. Could this be why their contemporaries whispered of strange rites and heretical teachings? Could this be the hidden root of their forbidden history? The Templars themselves never revealed their secrets. Their official chronicles speak little of their activities beneath the mosque. Yet, legends continued to grow. Later centuries tied the order to the Kabbalah, to alchemy, even to esoteric traditions that would inspire the Freemasons. For conspiracy theorists, the Temple Mount remains the birthplace of a hidden lineage of secret knowledge, passed down from the Templars into modern secret societies. Of course, skeptics argue that much of this is fantasy, retroactively projected onto the Templars by later storytellers. Perhaps they were merely repairing their headquarters, storing supplies, or conducting mundane construction. Perhaps their reputation for secrecy was simply the byproduct of medieval paranoia. But if that were the case, why do the legends endure with such intensity? Why does the very idea of hidden chambers beneath the Temple Mount capture the human imagination like few other mysteries? The answer may lie not in what they found, but in the perfect collision of myth, faith, and fear. The Templars chose to anchor themselves in the most symbolically charged site in the Christian imagination. By doing so, they invited centuries of speculation. Whether or not they uncovered forbidden relics, their very presence there was enough to spark legends that refused to die. And so, as we picture the Templars descending into the darkness beneath the Temple Mount, torches flickering against ancient stones, we must ask, did they touch the sacred? Did they uncover truths too dangerous to reveal? Or did they simply plant the seed of a legend that would one day overshadow their entire order? The answers remain buried, sealed beneath layers of stone, faith, and time. But one thing is certain, from the moment the Templars claimed the Temple Mount as their home, they became more than knights. They became mythmakers, guardians of mysteries that echo through the ages. When the Knights Templar first emerged, they were known as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. Their white mantles and crimson crosses symbolized purity and sacrifice, and their vows of poverty were meant to strip them of earthly temptation. To the eyes of pilgrims and kings alike, they were warriors who had renounced wealth in favor of devotion. And yet, within less than a century, these same humble knights would become one of the most powerful and wealthy organizations in the medieval world. How did men who claimed to own nothing come to own everything? The paradox of the Templars lay at the heart of their success. Each knight was bound to poverty. But the order itself was not. This distinction allowed the Templars as a collective to acquire lands, castles, and vast resources, even as individual brothers remained poor. As donations poured in from across Europe, the Templars transformed from a small brotherhood into a sprawling international institution. Noble families eager to support the crusading cause gifted them estates. Merchants, in exchange for protection, entrusted them with money and goods. Even kings began to recognize the value of having the Templars as allies. Their power grew not only from generosity but also from innovation. The Templars were among the first in Europe to master the art of financial security. Imagine a pilgrim traveling from Paris to Jerusalem. Carrying gold across thousands of miles was perilous, thieves and bandits lurked on every road. The Templars offered a solution. The pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar preceptory in France and receive a coded letter of credit. Upon arrival in the Holy Land, he could present this document and withdraw funds from another Templar house. In essence, the Templars had invented one of the earliest systems of international banking. This system revolutionized medieval travel and commerce. It was secure, efficient, and trusted across borders. Over time, their network of preceptories and commanderies functioned much like modern banks, safeguarding wealth, offering loans, and even financing armies. Kings and nobles borrowed heavily from the order, often pledging castles and lands as collateral. Ironically, rulers who commanded entire kingdoms found themselves financially dependent on a fraternity of knights who once begged for sustenance. The order's wealth wasn't limited to coin. They owned vast stretches of farmland in England, vineyards in France, mills in Spain, and bustling ports along the Mediterranean. Their properties were meticulously managed, with revenues flowing steadily into the coffers of the temple. Their castles, monolithic fortresses like Croc de Chevaliers in Syria or Tomar in Portugal, stood as both military bastions and symbols of dominance. Some were so advanced in design that they seemed impenetrable, incorporating features like concentric walls, underground passages, and massive water cisterns. To enemies, they were nightmares of stone. To allies, they were fortresses of hope. But with wealth came influence, and with influence came suspicion. How could a group sworn to humility command such riches? How could monks in armor hold sway over kings? Their very success bred whispers of corruption. Their secrecy, so essential to their discipline, only magnified the unease. People began to ask, were the Templars still holy warriors, or had they become merchants in chainmail? Even within Christendom, their power was unmatched. In battle, the Templars fought with a reputation for fearlessness. Bound by oath never to retreat unless outnumbered 3-1, they became the shock troops of crusading armies. Yet, off the battlefield, their role as financial brokers and landowners made them indispensable to the very kings who feared them. Monarchs owed them debts, the church relied on their loyalty. This dual nature, warriors and bankers, made the Templars unique, but also dangerous. One striking example of their growing clout came during the reign of King Henry III of England. At one point, Henry entrusted the English crown jewels to the Templars for safekeeping, storing them in the London Temple. Think of the symbolism, the treasures of a kingdom, guarded not by the king's men but by a foreign order of monks in armor. Such gestures cemented the Templars' reputation as incorruptible, but also as untouchable. The more they expanded, the more their influence seemed to transcend borders. Unlike other medieval institutions, which were tied to specific kingdoms or lords, the Templars answered only to the Pope. This papal protection gave them autonomy few others enjoyed. They were exempt from taxes, free from local laws, and immune to many secular authorities. In an age when kings often clashed with the Church, the Templars stood as a reminder of papal reach, an army of God loyal not to thrones, but to Rome. Yet beneath this polished exterior, cracks began to form. Their growing wealth drew envy from rival orders, especially the Knights Hospitaller, who also fought in the Holy Land. Secular lords, too, began to resent the order's independence. To peasants who worked their lands, the Templars were often landlords first and holy men second. And as the Crusades dragged on with dwindling success, critics questioned whether the order's riches were truly serving the cause or merely enriching themselves. Still, for over a century, the Templars managed to balance this paradox, living as paupers but ruling as princes. Their fortresses stood like monuments across Europe and the Middle East, their financial network spanned continents, and their influence reached the highest corridors of power. But with every coin they collected and every debt they secured, they sowed the seeds of future peril. Kings do not like to owe. And when debt turns to desperation, even holy warriors can be recast as villains. As we transition deeper into their story, we must remember this transformation. The Templars were no longer the humble 9 knights who vowed to protect pilgrims on dusty roads. They had become a global force, a corporation of faith, finance, and war. And while this meteoric rise brought them glory, it also painted a target on their backs. For in the medieval world, power without a crown was dangerous. And the Templars, cloaked in both armor and secrecy, had amassed more power than many kings could tolerate. When we imagine the Knights Templar, we often picture thundering charges across battlefields, swords raised in the name of God. But much of a Templar's life was not spent in glorious combat. Instead, it unfolded behind the thick stone walls of commanderies, castles, and monasteries, where discipline, devotion, and secrecy shaped their identity just as much as war ever did. To understand the order, we must step into their world, not as warriors, but as brothers bound to a life of strict routine and hidden rituals. The Templars followed a code unlike that of any other knights in Europe. Inspired by the rule of Saint Benedict and adapted by Bernard of Clairvaux, their daily existence blended the austerity of monks with the demands of soldiers. At dawn, they rose not to the clash of swords but to the sound of prayers. Hours of the divine office structured their day, each marked by chants and psalms. Even before breakfast, their voices echoed in stone chapels, a chorus of warriors reciting prayers of penitence. Their clothing reflected their vows. Each brother wore the iconic white mantle, symbolizing purity, emblazoned with the crimson cross, a stark reminder of the blood they were willing to spill for Christ. Beneath the cloak, however, their garments were simple and uniform, coarse tunics, rough fabrics, no jewelry or decoration. Unlike other knights who flaunted wealth through gilded armor and fine silks, Templars embraced humility, or at least the appearance of it. Vanity was forbidden. To own more than what was necessary was considered sin. Meals, too, were a matter of strict regulation. They ate in silence, heads bowed, listening as a brother read aloud from Scripture. Meat was limited, extravagance at the table was strictly prohibited. Bread, vegetables, fish, and watered wine were common staples. Their communal dining halls reinforced the idea that each knight was merely part of a greater whole, no individual could rise above the group. To remind them of mortality, even meals were punctuated by prayers and rituals of self-denial. Discipline extended to their private lives. The Templars were forbidden to marry, to pursue romantic attachments, or even to embrace their own families too closely. They were soldiers of Christ, not men of worldly ties. Women were strictly banned from Templar houses, even speaking too much to a woman was grounds for punishment. Chastity was a weapon as sharp as any sword, a way to sever all distractions from their sacred mission. But what truly set the Templars apart, and what gave rise to centuries of rumors, were their secretive rituals. Initiation into the order was no simple matter. When a new recruit sought admission, he was brought into a candlelit chapel, stripped of his worldly possessions, and asked 3 times if he truly understood the burdens he would bear. Then came the oath, to live in poverty, chastity, and obedience, to defend Christendom until death. Some accounts describe the initiate kneeling before the master of the temple, swearing loyalty not only to the order but to hidden truths whispered in the shadows. These ceremonies were cloaked in secrecy, and secrecy breeds speculation. Enemies of the Templars later accused them of blasphemy, claiming initiates were forced to spit on the cross, deny Christ, or engage in bizarre acts of humiliation. Some spoke of mysterious idols, grotesque heads worshipped in candlelit chambers. Others whispered of kisses exchanged in strange places as signs of loyalty. Were these accusations slander invented by rivals, or distorted echoes of genuine secret practices? The truth remains elusive, lost in the haze of history and the silence of the brothers who never broke their vows. Beyond ritual, punishments were swift and severe. A Templar who disobeyed orders might be flogged, forced to eat on the floor, or even expelled from the order entirely. Cowardice in battle was unthinkable, retreat without permission meant disgrace. Their iron discipline was not merely spiritual, it was the backbone of their military success. Each knight was trained to obey without hesitation, to place the mission above his own life. This absolute unity made the Templars one of the most effective fighting forces of the medieval world. Yet life was not entirely without comfort. Though bound by vows, the Templars enjoyed certain privileges. They were respected, feared, and admired across Christendom. Commoners saw them as holy warriors, saints in armor. Pilgrims revered them as protectors. Their castles and commanderies provided stability and brotherhood in a violent, uncertain age. Within their ranks, a knight could rise not by birthright but by merit, a rare possibility in a rigidly hierarchical world. Still, the question of mystery lingers. Why did so many believe the Templars practiced forbidden rites? Part of the answer lies in their secrecy. Unlike monks in open monasteries, Templars lived behind guarded walls, their ceremonies closed to outsiders. Their dual identity, half monk, half warrior, made them hard to categorize, even harder to trust. When whispers of heresy emerged during their downfall, the public imagination was quick to fill the void with scandal. Whether or not the Templars truly engaged in strange rituals, the perception of secrecy was enough to create their legend. Their disciplined lifestyle, hidden initiations, and aura of mystery laid the groundwork for centuries of speculation. Were they holy ascetics, or occultists cloaked in the mantle of Christ? Were their vows a shield of faith, or a mask for darker truths? One thing remains clear, the Templars were unlike any other knights of their time. Their daily lives fused prayer and sword, humility and power, secrecy and discipline. And in this paradox, they became something more than men, they became symbols, both feared and revered, guardians of mysteries that still fascinate us today. The Knights Templar were once celebrated as Christ's most faithful warriors. They fought and died for the cross, their red banners flying above the deserts of the Holy Land. But as centuries passed, whispers began to twist their image. Rumors seeped from cloisters and courts, dark tales whispered by rivals, enemies, and frightened kings. These stories claimed that the Templars, those holy warriors, were no longer the servants of Christ, but the disciples of darker powers. It is within these shadows of suspicion that their legacy shifted from sacred to forbidden. The idol of Baphomet. The most infamous accusation leveled against the Templars was their alleged worship of a mysterious figure known as Baphomet. Chroniclers described it variously as a severed head, a demonic idol, or a grotesque statue with both male and female features. Some claimed it was a brass head with ruby eyes, capable of whispering secrets. Others insisted it was a pagan deity to whom the Templars bent their knees. But what was Baphomet? Was it simply a corruption of Muhammad, a medieval misunderstanding that accused the Templars of adopting Muslim practices during their time in the East? Or was it, as some later occultists believed, a true esoteric symbol, representing hidden knowledge and forbidden rites? During their trials in the early 14th century, dozens of captured Templars confessed under torture to venerating this mysterious idol. They spoke of kissing it, praying to it, even believing it granted them wealth and protection. Skeptics argue these confessions were forced and fabricated. But the image of the Templars kneeling before a dark god was enough to ignite terror across Europe. Spitting on the cross. Another charge shocked Christendom, that new initiates into the order were forced to spit upon the cross, to trample the symbol of Christ, and to deny his name. To the faithful, this was the ultimate betrayal, an inversion of everything the Templars supposedly stood for. Again, many knights later claimed such confessions were wrung from them under brutal torture. And yet, the accusations stuck. Why? Because secrecy breeds suspicion. Outsiders were never allowed to witness Templar initiations. What took place in those candlelit chapels remained a mystery, and mystery in the medieval imagination quickly became heresy. If the Templars did not truly spit upon the cross, why were so many willing to believe they had? Perhaps because, in their very structure, the order seemed to exist beyond ordinary Christian life. They answered to no king, no local bishop, only to the Pope himself. To some, this independence smelled of arrogance. To others, it suggested allegiance to something, or someone, outside the Church's control. Forbidden knowledge beyond idols and blasphemy, there were subtler accusations, that the Templars possessed books of heretical wisdom, teachings gleaned from their years in the Holy Land. Some believed they had studied Islamic mysticism, Jewish Kabbalah, or even ancient Gnostic texts. To their critics, this made them not holy warriors, but dabblers in forbidden arts. It was said they whispered secret prayers not to the Christian God but to hidden forces. That they practiced magic, alchemy, and divination. That they had unlocked mysteries of life and death which the Church had sought to bury. These were dangerous accusations in a world where knowledge itself could be heresy. And here lies the question, did the Templars truly embrace these practices, or were they simply accused of doing so by those who envied their power? Islamic influence and occult rumors. The Templars lived and fought in close contact with Muslim warriors, scholars, and mystics. Unlike most Europeans, they had first-hand exposure to the sophisticated sciences of the Islamic Golden Age, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. To some, this cultural exchange was a mark of corruption. They accused the Templars of adopting foreign, even pagan, ideas. Later legends claim that the Templars were custodians of esoteric knowledge they learned from Muslim Sufis or from Jewish mystics in the Holy Land. Could their reputation for secrecy have masked genuine intellectual exploration? Perhaps. But in the paranoid eyes of medieval Europe, curiosity was indistinguishable from heresy. Secret rites and strange kisses. Perhaps the most salacious accusations came from the trials themselves. Templar brothers, racked with pain on the rack, confessed to obscene rituals. They were said to exchange kisses on the mouth, the navel, even the base of the spine during initiation ceremonies. To their accusers, these were not signs of brotherhood but of unnatural sin. Modern historians tend to dismiss these claims as inventions designed to scandalize. Yet, in the fevered atmosphere of 14th-century Europe, such stories were irresistible. They painted the Templars as not just heretics but degenerates, men whose hidden lives mocked the very faith they claimed to defend. Victims of slander, or keepers of secrets? The Templars' downfall was built upon these accusations. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order, ordered their arrest. Torture extracted confessions that confirmed every fear, idol worship, blasphemy, occult rites. Though many knights later recanted, the damage was done. But the deeper question lingers, were these accusations entirely fabricated, or was there some kernel of truth? Could the Templars have developed private rituals, symbolic or allegorical, that were misunderstood, or deliberately twisted, by their enemies? Or had they truly uncovered forbidden knowledge beneath the Temple Mount, secrets too dangerous to share, which later fueled tales of heresy? What we know for certain is this: the Templars' combination of secrecy, wealth, and independence made them ideal scapegoats. Kings and popes could project onto them every fear and resentment of Christendom. And once the whispers began, they grew into a storm that no fortress could withstand. The legacy of heresy. Centuries later, these accusations would take on new lives. In the 19th century, occultists like Eliphas Levi resurrected the image of Baphomet, drawing it as a goat-headed figure with torch and pentagram, a symbol that endures today in esoteric and satanic traditions. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and other secret societies have all claimed the Templar legacy, weaving the accusations of heresy into their own mythologies. Whether true or false, the whispers of occult practices became the most enduring part of the Templars' legend. No longer were they remembered only as crusaders. They became something darker, custodians of mysteries, practitioners of forbidden rites, shadows moving at the edge of Christian orthodoxy. And so, as we move forward into the story of their downfall, we must ask, were the Templars destroyed by lies, or by truths too dangerous to be revealed? For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar stood as the shield of Christendom, wealthy, respected, and feared. Their red crosses flew over the sands of the Holy Land, their fortresses dominated Europe, their coffers overflowed with riches. But as the Crusades faltered and kingdoms crumbled, the Templars found themselves without a holy war to fight. In the silence that followed, they were left with their wealth, their power, and their secrecy. And that made them dangerous. The shadow of debt. By the dawn of the 14th century, Europe itself had changed. The crusading spirit was fading, Jerusalem had been lost, and Christian kingdoms in the East had collapsed one by one. To kings who once relied on the Templars' swords, the order now looked less like an army of God and more like a wealthy corporation. One king in particular saw the Templars not as allies, but as prey, Philip IV of France, remembered as Philip the Fair. His reign was ambitious but costly. Wars with England, lavish spending, and constant political maneuvering had drained the French treasury. And when a king finds himself drowning in debt, he looks to his creditors. The Templars were those creditors. They had financed Philip's wars, safeguarded his treasury, and held vast estates within France. Instead of seeing them as protectors, Philip saw them as rivals, an empire within his kingdom, loyal to Rome, beyond his control. Worse still, he owed them money he could never repay. And so, Philip devised a plan as ruthless as it was shocking, the destruction of the Knights Templar. Friday the 13th. The fateful blow fell on Friday, October 13, 1307, a date that still echoes in superstition. At dawn, across all of France, Philip's men stormed Templar commanderies. Knights were dragged from their beds, chained, and accused of heresy. The arrests were swift, coordinated, and merciless. The charges were shocking: idol worship, blasphemy, unnatural sins, spitting on the cross. Every rumor that had ever haunted the Templars was suddenly unleashed as fact. Thousands were taken prisoner. Their properties were seized. Their order was declared corrupt, rotten to the core. It was a masterstroke of propaganda. Philip knew the public was already primed by centuries of whispers about the Templars' secret rituals. Now, with the king himself declaring them heretics, few dared to defend them. Fear spread like wildfire. Friday the 13th was no longer just a day, it became a symbol of treachery and doom. Torture and confession. The arrests were only the beginning. Under Philip's command, the Inquisition subjected the Templars to brutal torture. Men were stretched on racks, their limbs pulled until bones cracked. Some were burned with hot irons, others drowned through water torture. Under such agony, knights confessed to anything their captors demanded. They admitted to worshipping idols. They confessed to spitting on the cross. They acknowledged obscene rituals and unnatural sins. The more they confessed, the more Philip's accusations seemed justified. Yet many later retracted their words, declaring they had spoken only to escape unbearable pain. Still, in the eyes of the public, the damage was done. The Templars' sacred image was shattered. They were no longer holy warriors, they were heretics. The Pope's dilemma. At first, Pope Clement V was hesitant to believe the charges. The Templars were, after all, the Church's warriors, loyal to the papacy. But Philip was relentless. He pressured, threatened, and manipulated until Clement had little choice but to yield. In 1312, under the weight of political pressure, the Pope formally dissolved the Order of the Temple. Its lands and wealth were, in theory, transferred to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. In practice, much of it flowed into royal treasuries, particularly Philip's. The greatest military order of Christendom was no more. the martyrdom of Jacques de Molay. Yet the story did not end with the suppression of the order. Its final act came in 1314, on an island in the Seine River in Paris. There, after years of imprisonment, the last Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was led to his execution. He was old by then, weary from torture and chains. But as he stood before the crowd, flames crackling at his feet, he spoke words that would echo through the ages. He declared the innocence of the Templars, proclaiming that their confessions were lies forced upon them. He denied the charges of heresy, and as the fire consumed him, he is said to have cried out a curse, that both King Philip and Pope Clement would answer before God within a year. Legend tells us the curse came true. Within months, both Philip and Clement were dead, their sudden demise is seen as divine vengeance for the destruction of the Templars. Whether fact or coincidence, the tale sealed de Molay's image as a martyr, and the Templars as victims of treachery rather than true heresy. What was destroyed, and what survived the fall of the Templars was brutal, but it was not complete. Across Europe, some knights quietly melted into other orders. Others retired into obscurity, protected by sympathetic rulers. In Portugal, the order was rebranded as the Order of Christ, continuing under a different name. In Scotland and Switzerland, legends claim fugitive Templars found refuge, forming secret brotherhoods that would outlive their supposed destruction. But the greatest casualty was knowledge. If the Templars truly possessed forbidden relics, secret texts, or esoteric wisdom uncovered beneath the Temple Mount, then much of it was lost, or deliberately hidden. Were the treasures of the Temple destroyed in Philip's purge? Or spirited away, locked in vaults and caves, awaiting discovery? The forbidden legacy, the destruction of the Templars, marked not only the end of a powerful order, but also the birth of a legend. Their downfall transformed them from warriors into myths. Friday the 13th became a symbol of doom. Baphomet became an icon of occultism. And Jacques de Molay's fiery death became the spark of centuries of speculation. In the centuries that followed, the Templars would rise again, not in flesh and blood, but in story. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, occultists, and conspiracy theorists all claimed their legacy. In destroying the Templars, Philip and Clement had succeeded only in creating one of history's most enduring mysteries. The turning point, the fall of the Temple, was a turning point in medieval history. It was the moment when power crushed faith, when greed triumphed over loyalty, when kings proved that even God's warriors could be undone by politics. But it was also the moment the Templars slipped from history into legend. For though their order was dissolved, their secrets remained. And as long as questions linger, about hidden relics, lost treasures, and forbidden rites, the Knights Templar will never truly die. The flames of Jacques de Molay's execution in 1314 were meant to be the final chapter of the Knights Templar. The order had been dissolved, its leaders executed, its wealth seized. To kings and popes, the Templars were finished, extinguished from history. And yet, the story did not end in the ashes of Paris. Instead, it transformed. For even as Europe declared their extinction, whispers spread of survival. Legends claimed that the Templars had not died, but gone underground. That their swords, their treasures, and their secrets lived on in shadow. The vanishing fleet, perhaps the most enduring mystery, is what happened to the Templar fleet. On the eve of their arrest in 1307, the Templars possessed a fleet of ships harbored at La Rochelle, a port on the Atlantic coast of France. Yet when Philip's men stormed their commanderies, the ships were gone. Not a single vessel was seized. Where did they sail? Some say the knights escaped to Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by Rome, had no reason to betray them. Legends tell of Templar knights fighting at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, appearing like ghostly cavalry to turn the tide against the English. Others whisper the ships sailed further, to Portugal, where the order was quietly rebranded as the Order of Christ and allowed to continue under a new name. More tantalizing theories suggest the fleet vanished across the Atlantic, carrying knights and treasure to the New World long before Columbus. On the windswept shores of Nova Scotia, symbols carved in stone are said to resemble Templar crosses. Was this coincidence, or evidence of an order reborn on distant shores? Portugal, the order reborn. Unlike France, not all kingdoms turned against the Templars. In Portugal, King Denis recognized their value. Rather than destroy them, he rebranded them in 1319 as the Order of Christ. Their lands, castles, and traditions lived on under a different banner. This survival was not symbolic, it was real. The Order of Christ became one of the most powerful organizations in Portugal, financing the voyages of discovery that would reshape the world. Henry the Navigator, the great patron of exploration, was a grand master of the order. Ships flying the cross of Christ sailed around Africa, across the Atlantic, and into history. If the Templars truly survived anywhere, it was here, their mission reborn not in crusades but in exploration. Scotland and the Mason connection. In Scotland, the survival of the Templars is less documented but far more romantic. Legend claims that when Robert the Bruce faced the English at Bannockburn, a band of mysterious knights rode into battle beside him, striking fear into the enemy and securing Scottish independence. Were they fugitive Templars, sheltered in a land already condemned by Rome? From this legend, another theory was born, that the Templars blended into the stonemason guilds of Scotland, laying the seeds of what would one day become the Freemasons. Freemasonry, with its secret rituals, symbols, and emphasis on hidden knowledge, has long been linked, at least in myth, to the Templars. Though historians debate the connection, the symbolism endures, the idea of the Templars transforming into a secret brotherhood, carrying their traditions through the centuries. Switzerland and secret strongholds. Other tales place the Templars in Switzerland, where they supposedly founded banking traditions that mirrored their medieval financial systems. Switzerland's reputation for neutrality, secrecy, and wealth is sometimes traced back, through legend, to fugitive Templars who brought their financial expertise into the mountains. Though the evidence is thin, the echoes of the Templars' banking innovations are undeniable. The treasure that vanished. The question of survival is inseparable from the question of treasure. If the Templars truly fell in 1307, where did their legendary wealth go? Kings like Philip expected to seize immense riches, but found surprisingly little. This fueled speculation that the Templars had spirited away their treasure before the arrests. Theories abound: hidden vaults beneath Paris, buried caches in the French countryside, or secret shipments carried away by the missing fleet. Some say the treasure was not gold at all, but relics, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, sacred texts. If so, survival would not just mean men, but knowledge and artifacts too dangerous to destroy. Extinction, or transformation. Of course, it is possible that the Templars truly did perish. Many knights were executed or imprisoned, their properties seized, their leadership shattered. In most of Europe, the order was dismantled brick by brick. The stories of survival may be nothing more than legends, fabrications born of fascination with an order that had become too powerful to vanish quietly. And yet, extinction does not explain the persistence of their symbols. Templar crosses appear in unexpected places. Their legends intertwine with secret societies. Their supposed treasures re-emerge in myths from Portugal to Nova Scotia. It is as though, even if the knights themselves perished, the idea of the Templars survived, and ideas can be more enduring than armies. The dual legacy. The survival question splits their legacy in two. On one side, they were victims of power, annihilated by kings who feared their wealth. On the other, they were fugitives who slipped into legend, carrying their secrets into new lands and new orders. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Some branches may have been destroyed, others absorbed, still others transformed under new names. Whatever the reality, their supposed extinction only deepened the mystery. The Templars did not vanish from history, they became its greatest what if. What if they escaped? What if they carried their knowledge across oceans? What if, in secret, they continue even now? Echoes of survival. The Templars' survival, or extinction, is less important than the enduring fascination their story inspires. Whether they truly fled to Portugal, Scotland, or beyond, their legend has survived centuries of erasure. It lives in conspiracy theories, in Freemasonry, in tales of hidden treasure. It survives in the belief that no power so great could be destroyed completely. The truth may never be known. But perhaps that is the point. Survival is not always about flesh and blood, it is about memory, symbol, and story. And in that sense, the Knights Templar are immortal. When the last Grand Master of the Templars burned on the Isle de la Cite in 1314, many believed the order had perished with him. But rumors persisted that the Templars' greatest secrets had been spirited away, hidden aboard ships, buried in vaults, or carried across oceans. And here begins one of the most tantalizing theories of all, that the Templars not only survived, but may have reached the shores of the New World nearly 2 centuries before Columbus. The vanishing fleet and the Atlantic mystery in 1307, when King Philip's men seized the Templar commanderies across France, they expected to confiscate immense treasure. But in La Rochelle, where the Templars maintained a fleet, they found nothing. No ships. No treasure. The vessels had vanished, sailing into history without a trace. This disappearance gave birth to centuries of speculation. Did the ships scatter to sympathetic ports in Scotland and Portugal? Or did they sail further, across the uncharted Atlantic? In the 14th century, maps were limited, but sailors knew of islands in the west, Iceland, Greenland, and whispers of lands beyond. If anyone had the resources, discipline, and courage to attempt such a voyage, it was the Templars. Oak Island and the Money Pit. The most famous legend tying the Templars to the New World centers on Oak Island, off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada. In the late 18th century, explorers discovered a mysterious pit filled with layers of logs, stones, and booby traps. As they dug deeper, they found tantalizing clues, parchments, strange symbols, and construction far beyond what simple settlers could achieve. The site became known as the Money Pit. Over centuries, treasure hunters poured fortunes into excavations, convinced that something extraordinary lay buried there. Theories abound: pirate gold, Spanish treasure, but one legend stands out. Some believe Oak Island hides the Templar treasure itself, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or sacred texts smuggled from Europe. Supporters point to Templar-like symbols carved into nearby stones, including crosses and geometric designs. Skeptics dismiss them as coincidence. Yet the allure remains. The idea that fugitive Templars crossed the ocean and hid their greatest secrets beneath the forests of Nova Scotia continues to captivate adventurers even today. The Westford Knight and American carvings. Another piece of evidence comes from Westford, Massachusetts, where a carved effigy of a medieval knight lies etched into a rock. Local tradition claims it marks the grave of a fallen Templar, perhaps part of an expedition to the New World in the 14th century. The carving is faint and weathered, and scholars debate whether it is truly medieval, or a much later creation. Still, believers see in its lines the unmistakable shape of a knightly sword and shield. Further north, in Maine and Nova Scotia, explorers have uncovered stone crosses and petroglyphs that some attribute to European visitors long before Columbus. Are these remnants of Viking voyages, or Templar journeys? The answer remains elusive. Portugal's secret voyages. If the Templars truly reached the New World, Portugal may have been the key. After the order was suppressed, King Denis of Portugal transformed the Templars into the Order of Christ, preserving their wealth and traditions under a new name. In the 15th century, the Order of Christ funded Portugal's voyages of discovery, sending explorers like Vasco da Gama and Prince Henry the Navigator into uncharted waters. Could it be that the navigational knowledge guiding these voyages was not new, but inherited? Some argue that Templar maps, records, and perhaps even first-hand experience of Atlantic lands were passed down through the Order of Christ. If so, Columbus's discovery may have been centuries late. Conspiracies and the Grail across the ocean. The most dramatic versions of the theory suggest the Templars carried not just treasure but relics of unimaginable importance: the Holy Grail, the Shroud of Turin, or the Ark of the Covenant. Fleeing Philip's purge, they supposedly transported these sacred objects across the ocean, hiding them in remote lands where kings and popes could never reach them. Oak Island becomes, in this narrative, not just a treasure site but a vault of faith, a hidden temple protecting Christianity's most sacred relics. Whether these stories are true or not, they reveal the enduring hunger to believe that the Templars' secrets were too great to simply vanish in Europe's flames. History or myth? Mainstream historians argue that there is little concrete evidence of Templar voyages to the Americas. They point out that most of the supposed carvings and relics are ambiguous, and that no medieval documents confirm such expeditions. The Vikings, not the Templars, remain the only proven Europeans to reach the New World before Columbus. And yet, the theory refuses to die. Why? Because the Templars themselves were masters of secrecy, and their disappearance left a void that legends eagerly filled. The missing fleet, the missing treasure, the strange symbols, all become pieces of a puzzle that fuels the imagination. The enduring mystery, whether fact or fantasy, the idea of Templars in the New World speaks to a deeper truth: they remain symbols of the forbidden, the hidden, the just out of reach mystery. Even centuries after their destruction, people look for their hand in unexplained ruins, buried treasure, and coded symbols. Perhaps the Templars never set foot in the Americas. Or perhaps they did, leaving behind faint traces waiting to be uncovered. Either way, the very possibility transforms them from medieval warriors into timeless explorers, guardians of secrets that may still lie buried beneath foreign soil. The Templars may have been broken by kings and condemned by popes, but their presence never truly vanished. Across Europe, their symbols remain carved into stone, their architecture still rises against the sky, and their mysterious codes whisper from the past. If their armies were destroyed, their legacy lived on in the sacred geometry of cathedrals, in cryptic engravings, and in the forbidden symbols that later secret societies claimed as their own. Gothic cathedrals and sacred geometry. The rise of Gothic architecture in the 12th and 13th centuries coincided with the height of Templar power. Cathedrals like Chartres, Notre Dame, and Reims rose like mountains of stone, their spires reaching toward heaven, their stained-glass windows illuminating the faithful with kaleidoscopes of divine light. Many historians credit the Templars with financing, and perhaps even influencing, this architectural revolution. Their immense wealth funded projects that required generations of labor. But legends go further, suggesting the knights carried architectural knowledge from the East, esoteric geometry, sacred mathematics, and symbolic designs that transformed mere stone into spiritual power. At Chartres Cathedral, labyrinth patterns carved into the floor echo designs found in the Holy Land. At Notre Dame, strange figures peer from the stonework, grotesques and symbols that seem to hint at hidden teachings. To some, these cathedrals are not just churches, but books of stone, encoded texts where Templar secrets were preserved for those with eyes to see. The red cross and hidden marks. The most recognizable Templar symbol is, of course, the red cross on their white mantles. But this simple emblem appears in places far beyond their cloaks. Engraved in castles, carved into church walls, etched into gravestones, the Templar cross became a marker of both presence and mystery. In southern France, crosses with flared arms, similar to Templar insignia, dot remote chapels. In Portugal, the Order of Christ adapted the cross into their own, emblazoning it on sails that would carry explorers across oceans. Even today, these crosses endure on flags, coats of arms, and insignias, a symbol whose origin is unmistakably Templar. But beyond the cross, more cryptic marks appear. Some Templar chapels contain carvings of two knights riding a single horse, an image both symbolic of poverty and hinting at duality, unity, and secret brotherhood. Others show strange geometric shapes, suns, moons, and stars, symbols that later resurfaced in Masonic lodges centuries later. Codes and hidden messages. One of the most enduring mysteries is whether the Templars embedded hidden codes into their architecture and manuscripts. Some researchers point to the use of numbers, particularly 3, 7, and 13, in their constructions, numbers charged with biblical and mystical meaning. Others claim that within the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals lie mathematical ratios tied to sacred geometry, echoing knowledge traced back to Pythagoras, Egypt, and even the East. To the faithful, these were designs meant to glorify God. To conspiracy theorists, they were encrypted messages, a visual language passed down through stone. Perhaps the most controversial claim is that the Templars left behind maps, geometric alignments of chapels and commanderies pointing toward hidden sites, perhaps even toward the New World. Skeptics dismiss this as fantasy, yet the allure of Templar codes continues to inspire treasure hunters and theorists alike. The Shroud of Turin. Among the relics linked to the Templars, none is more provocative than the Shroud of Turin, the linen cloth said to bear the image of Christ. Some scholars argue that the shroud was in Templar custody during the years of their greatest secrecy. In 1204, when Crusaders sacked Constantinople, they looted countless relics. Could the Templars have taken the shroud, guarding it until their downfall? During the trials, witnesses claimed the knights worshipped a mysterious bearded head. To critics, this was evidence of idolatry. But to some historians, it suggests they possessed the shroud, venerating the faint image of Christ's face imprinted upon it. If true, then their so-called heresy may have been nothing more than secret guardianship of a relic too sacred to expose to political hands. Influence on secret societies. Centuries after their destruction, the Templar legacy re-emerged in the rise of Freemasonry. The Masons claimed spiritual descent from the knightly order, adopting their symbols, rituals, and myths. Masonic temples often display Templar crosses, swords, and references to Solomon's Temple, the very site where the knights had once made their home. Even the idea of hidden knowledge, preserved through ritual and secrecy, echoes Templar traditions. Whether this connection is historical fact or myth woven for prestige, the symbolism is undeniable. The Templars had become the archetype of the secret brotherhood, their forbidden symbols resurrected in new forms. The forbidden legacy. The Templars' symbols endure because they exist in the realm of duality. A cross is both holy and martial. A labyrinth is both a path to God and a code of mystery. A grotesque face on a cathedral can be dismissed as decoration, or seen as a veiled message. To the Church, their legacy was meant to be erased. Yet stone remembers what men forget. And in carvings, cathedrals, and symbols, the Templars continue to whisper across centuries. Were they architects of hidden codes, or are we projecting modern mysteries onto medieval stone? Perhaps both. For every generation finds in the Templars what it seeks: saints, heretics, magicians, or architects of the sacred. And as long as their symbols endure in stone and art, the Templars themselves endure, reminding us that their story was never truly destroyed, only encrypted in the fabric of history. The flames that consumed Jacques de Molay in 1314 were supposed to reduce the Knights Templar to ash and memory. Yet, paradoxically, their destruction only magnified their legend. Centuries later, the Templars would resurface, not as an active order, but as an idea, a symbol of secrecy and forbidden knowledge. From Enlightenment secret societies to 20th-century occultists and even modern entertainment, the Templars have become the cornerstone of conspiracy itself. Freemasonry and the Reborn Order. The first great revival of the Templar legend came in the 18th century with the rise of Freemasonry. Masons, secretive societies of stonemasons and thinkers, began to claim spiritual descent from the Templars. Their lodges were decorated with swords, crosses, and references to Solomon's Temple, the same site that gave the Templars their name. Some Masonic rites explicitly adopted Templar imagery. The Knights Templar degree, in York Rite Masonry, became one of the highest honors, drawing a direct line between medieval warrior monks and Enlightenment-era brotherhoods. Whether this was true continuity or symbolic borrowing mattered little, the myth was powerful. The Templars became the archetype of the secret society, their aura of forbidden mystery breathing life into a new age of ritual and symbolism. Revolution and secret orders. As Europe moved into the age of revolution, Templar myths became political weapons. Some revolutionaries in France styled themselves as heirs to the order, casting their struggle against monarchy and church as a continuation of the Templar fight against oppression. Jacobins in the French Revolution even invoked Templar imagery in their rhetoric. Later, esoteric groups like the Rosicrucians and occult fraternities wove the Templars into their origin stories. For them, the order had not been destroyed but had gone underground, preserving secret wisdom passed through generations. These myths gave such groups an aura of ancient legitimacy, even if the historical links were tenuous. Occult revival in the 19th century. The 19th century saw the birth of modern occultism, and with it, the Templars re-emerged once more. French magician Eliphas Lévi famously illustrated Baphomet as a goat-headed, winged figure, declaring it the idol of the Templars. Though completely speculative, his depiction cemented the image of the Templars as occultists, guardians of forbidden rites. From there, the idea spread. Mystics, spiritualists, and occultists across Europe claimed the Templars had guarded secrets of alchemy, Kabbalah, and hidden gospels. To them, the order was not destroyed in 1314, it merely went deeper into the shadows, its wisdom reserved for those deemed worthy. The Nazis and the Dark Templar myth in the 20th century, even darker appropriations emerged. Nazi occultists, obsessed with Aryan myths and hidden knowledge, sought to tie their ideology to ancient brotherhoods. Heinrich Himmler's SS was deliberately modeled as a knightly order, drawing on imagery eerily similar to the Templars. Himmler even envisioned Wewelsburg Castle in Germany as a new temple of the SS, its circular chamber echoing Templar legends of secret rituals. Though the Nazis distorted history for their own ends, their fascination with the Templars demonstrates the enduring pull of the order's myth. They became a blank canvas on which tyrants could project fantasies of power, secrecy, and destiny. Popular culture and the eternal allure beyond politics and occultism, the Templars found immortality in popular culture. Novels, films, and games resurrect them endlessly. From Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum to Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, the Templars appear as keepers of secrets, guardians of the Holy Grail, or conspirators shaping world history from the shadows. In video games like Assassin's Creed, they are portrayed as the eternal enemies of freedom, an order that never truly died but continues to manipulate humanity. In films like Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, they guard sacred relics in forgotten temples. Even in modern documentaries and television shows, the Templars remain a magnet for mystery, treasure hunts, and forbidden history. Why do they endure so vividly in popular imagination? Because they embody the perfect paradox: monks who were also warriors, paupers who became bankers, saints who were accused of heresy. Their duality makes them endlessly adaptable, heroes, villains, martyrs, or conspirators, depending on the storyteller. The conspiracy that never ends today. Conspiracy theories continue to weave the Templars into everything from global banking cabals to the founding of America. Some claim the Templar treasure funds shadow governments. Others believe their lineage survives in modern elites, pulling the strings of world events. In internet forums and speculative books, the order is cast as the hidden hand behind history, guiding humanity in secret. These claims are rarely grounded in evidence, but they thrive because the Templars left a perfect vacuum. Their destruction was sudden, brutal, and cloaked in false confessions. Their fleet vanished. Their treasure disappeared. Their secrets were never revealed. And in that silence, imagination rushed in. Myth stronger than history, whether in Freemason lodges, Nazi fantasies, or Hollywood blockbusters, the Templars have become more powerful in myth than they ever were in life. The true knights of the 12th and 13th centuries were flesh-and-blood men, bound by vows, fighting brutal wars. But the Templars of legend are something else entirely: eternal conspirators, guardians of forbidden truths, shadows that never die. It is this transformation, from historical order to mythical archetype, that ensures their immortality. The Templars may have been burned at the stake, but the idea of them survived, shape-shifting across centuries, becoming whatever each generation needed them to be. The story of the Knights Templar begins with dust and blood on the roads to Jerusalem, and it ends with fire consuming their last Grand Master on the banks of the Seine. In between, it is a saga of paradoxes: warriors who were monks, paupers who became kings of finance, protectors accused of heresy. Their rise was meteoric, their fall catastrophic. And yet, their legend is eternal. From warriors to myths, the Templars were born of necessity, forged in the chaos of the First Crusade. They pledged their swords to God and their lives to protecting pilgrims, but soon grew into a power that rivaled kings and terrified popes. Their discipline made them invincible in battle. Their innovation made them pioneers of banking. Their secrecy made them mysterious. When the world turned against them, it was not on the battlefield but in the courts of kings. Accused of heresy, tortured into confessions, and burned at the stake, they were erased not by Islam or foreign armies, but by the very Christendom they had served. Their fall was proof that in the medieval world, power without a crown was a death sentence. The end that wasn't, and yet, for all their destruction, the Templars never truly disappeared. Their symbols remain carved into stone, their stories etched into the architecture of cathedrals and castles. Legends of survival in Portugal, Scotland, and even the New World kept their memory alive. Every missing treasure, every unexplained ruin, every whispered conspiracy became a canvas on which the Templars' shadow was painted. Unlike other medieval orders that passed quietly into history, the Templars refused to die. Their very mystery kept them alive. A mirror of humanity. Perhaps the reason the Templars endure is that they are more than an order of knights. They are a mirror of our deepest fears and desires. For believers, they were martyrs of faith, betrayed by corrupt kings. For skeptics, they were heretics who dabbled in forbidden knowledge. For dreamers, they are the eternal guardians of hidden treasures, the Grail, the Ark, secret scrolls buried beneath Jerusalem. Every generation finds in the Templars what it seeks: purity, corruption, wisdom, conspiracy. Their story is not fixed, it is fluid, reshaping itself to fit the needs of each new age. The power of silence. What truly fuels the Templar legend is what we do not know. Their archives vanished. Their treasures were never found. Their rituals remain shrouded in secrecy. That silence is louder than any chronicle. It is a void filled endlessly by speculation, myth, and imagination. The missing fleet, the idol of Baphomet, the curses of Jacques de Molay, these may be fragments of truth, or inventions of power. But it hardly matters. Once spoken, they became part of the story, impossible to erase. Shadows that refuse to die. More than 7 centuries after their destruction, the Knights Templar remain among the most famous names in history. They live in conspiracy theories, in secret societies, in novels, films, and games. Their cross still flies on flags, their name still inspires awe, and their supposed secrets still drive explorers to dig into forgotten earth. They were destroyed by fire and sword, but not by time. The kings who condemned them are forgotten, the popes who excommunicated them are footnotes. But the Templars endure, shadows that refuse to die. Perhaps that is the final truth of their story, not the Grail, not hidden treasure, not forbidden rites. The true treasure of the Templars is their legend itself. A story so powerful that it outlived their order, their kings, and even their world. And so, as we close the book on their history, one question remains. Did the Templars truly vanish, or are they still among us, their secrets hidden in plain sight, waiting for those bold enough to uncover them? The answer, like the order itself, remains forbidden. The story of the Knights Templar may seem like it ended in fire and ashes 700 years ago, but history has a way of leaving echoes. The men who rode under the Red Cross are long gone, yet their shadow stretches across our modern world in ways both subtle and profound. The legal ghosts. In 2007, the Vatican quietly released documents from the secret archives, revealing the results of the Chinon parchment, a forgotten record of Pope Clement V's absolution of the Templars. According to this parchment, the order was indeed guilty of misconduct, but not of outright heresy. In effect, the Church itself had acknowledged their innocence. 7 centuries too late, the Templars were partially vindicated. This revelation reignited debates. Had they been sacrificed on the altar of royal ambition? Were they martyrs of politics rather than sinners of faith? The shin on parchment did not erase the myths, but it proved one thing beyond doubt: the official story we inherited was carefully engineered. The tourism of mystery today, Templar castles and chapels draw millions of visitors. From Tomar in Portugal to Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, tourists flock not simply to see stone and mortar, but to feel the aura of the forbidden. Guidebooks sell legends as much as history. Treasure hunters still dig at Oak Island. Secret society enthusiasts still whisper of hidden vaults and underground chambers. The Templars have become a brand of mystery itself. Their image sells books, films, games, and tours. What was once accusation and slander has become entertainment and myth-making. The cultural afterlife. In many ways, the Templars' greatest survival has not been in blood, but in culture. Their cross, their codes, their aura of secrecy have been adopted by Freemasons, conspiracy theorists, esoteric groups, and even pop culture franchises. From Hollywood blockbusters to late-night internet rabbit holes, the Templars remain the quintessential secret keepers. But the deeper question lingers: why them? Why not the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, or countless other orders of the medieval world? The answer lies in their fall. No other order ended so dramatically, so mysteriously. No other knights carried secrets into the flames. Their very destruction birthed their immortality. What the Templars teach us: perhaps the real legacy of the Templars is not their supposed treasures, but the warning their story carries. They remind us that power without a crown is dangerous, that independence in a world of kings is fatal. They remind us how secrecy creates myth, how mystery breeds conspiracy. And they remind us that truth is fragile. A lie, repeated often enough, can burn men alive. A rumor, whispered in shadow, can outlast centuries of fact. The echo that remains: so, were the Templars heretics or saints? Were they guardians of sacred relics or victims of royal greed? The truth may never be fully known. But perhaps that uncertainty is why their legend endures. In every hidden chamber, every cryptic symbol, every unexplained ruin, the Templars live on, not as flesh and blood, but as eternal echoes. The world may never uncover the full truth of the Knights Templar. But as long as questions remain, questions about power, faith, and secrecy, there will always be those who look to the red cross on white and wonder, what secrets did they carry into the flames? The answer may remain forever forbidden.